Good morning, welcome to Breakfast with Naga Chetty and Charlie State.
Our headlines today. People living in England will learn this morning what level of restriction they'll face when lockdown ends.
Most areas are expected to be in the toughest 2 tiers when the Health Secretary announces the details later.
3 days of national mourning begin in Argentina for Diego Maradona, who's died at the age of 60.
Tributes have been pouring in from sporting greats around the world for the man described as one of the greatest footballers of all time who scored one of the most famous goals in history.
Good morning. The economic emergency has only just begun. A stark warning from the Chancellor in his spending review. He did find $4 billion for a fairer economy outside of London. The businesses believe him, though. I'll be finding out.
The small fish that's helping scientists learn how to heal people with serious injuries without scarring.
Good morning. It's a chilly start to the day. There's some frost, there's some fog around, but a lot of dry weather and a fair bit of sunshine. A bit more cloud though at times in the south. I'll have all the details in 10 minutes.
Good morning. It's Thursday, the 26th of November. Our top story is that people living in England will learn which restrictions they're going to face when lockdown ends next week, as the Health Secretary will make an announcement later this morning.
Most of the country is expected to be placed in the 2 toughest tiers of measures, with London going into Tier 2. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has more.
The shutters will come up on shops, gyms and hairdressers everywhere in England next week as lockdown ends. But what else opens again will depend on where you live. The government will announce later this morning which level of its new tier system it's decided will apply in each area. So what's likely to happen? Only a handful of areas are expected to go into Tier 1, where groups of up to 6 people will be able to meet again indoors or outdoors. Pubs and restaurants can open, with last orders at 10 p.m. and closing at 11 p.m. Most of England is likely to be in Tier 2. Groups of up to 6 people will still be able to meet outdoors, but not indoors, unless in a support bubble. Pubs can only reopen if they're operating as restaurants, and alcohol can only be served with a substantial meal. But some areas will be in the highest level of restrictions. Pubs and restaurants will be forced to provide takeaway only, and there'll be no mixing of households except up to 6 people in public outdoor spaces like parks. London is expected to be put into Tier 2. Some areas of northern England have already had months of tight restrictions and fear they are headed for Tier 3.
I think it's more likely than not that the government will put us in Tier 3, given the statements that ministers have made about the majority of people being disappointed and practically nobody being in Tier 1. I think they're giving a very clear steer that they are going to err on the side of caution.
Other areas, like Lincolnshire, were in the lowest tier before lockdown. Cases have soared in some parts of the county, but not in others. They're among several local authorities and MPs who've appealed to the government to take that into account and not to impose higher tiers across entire counties.
We've got areas on the east coast which are pretty high at the moment, although they are coming down. And we've got other areas inland which are below the national average. And it would seem very perverse to actually force businesses and families to actually endure the highest restrictions when there's actually no need in those particular areas.
The government says it will look at local context as a factor. That could include if an area is a commuter zone or has lots of students, for example. Rapid community testing will be offered to areas which do go into Tier 3. In Liverpool, it's been credited with helping to cut transmission of the virus. The government says doing that is key to moving back down the tiers. It's promising to review the allocations by the 16th of December. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
Teesside in the northeast of England is expected to go into Tier 3. The area still has some of the highest levels of coronavirus infection rates in the country.
Our reporter Geeta Pensay is in Middlesbrough for us. Geeta, morning to you. Now, the impact this is going to have on businesses and the way people are living, how does this look?
Absolutely. The impact could be huge. I'm here at the Dickens Inn in Middlesbrough town centre. Spoken to the owner this morning, and she, among lots of people within the hospitality sector across England are so nervous about finding out which area the tier for their area will be because of the implication, particularly if it's the most severe tier. So here in Middlesbrough, local leaders are anticipating that the town will be placed into the most severe tier, tier 3. And that's because despite the infection rate dropping, at one stage it was 500 per 100,000 people. It's now 327, but it's still much higher than other parts of England. Now, as we heard in the piece, there are commonalities between the tiers. So things like non-essential shops will reopen, and also people can meet in groups of up to 6 in public outdoor spaces. But if you're in tier 3, then different households still aren't allowed to mix indoors. And crucially, pubs, restaurants, bars will not be allowed to reopen unless it's for takeaway and delivery. And as I mentioned, I spoke to the owner this morning and she was saying that that's absolutely devastating and unsustainable. And she also told me that even tier 2 would be extremely problematic for her bar, which relies really on alcohol sales and that nighttime economy. So we'll be hearing from the government later, and there are lots of different factors. The infection rate is one of them, but also things like the pressure on the local NHS. But people braced across the country really to find out which tier their local area will be in.
This is it. It's the final of the Rap Game UK 2020.
I'm coming for the top spot. I deserve to be #1. The final challenge, you guys are going to be performing on BBC One Extra.
I have no idea how this is going to go. It's so hard to call it.
BBC 3's The Rap Game UK. Stream the final Thursday at 7 p.m. only on iPlayer.
Hello, this is Breakfast with Naga Manchetti and Charlie State.
Good morning to you. Just after 7:30. Thanks for joining us. The economic emergency caused by the pandemic has only just begun. That's the warning from the Chancellor. It was when he set out his spending plans yesterday.
He promised billions on health, education and infrastructure, but despite this, it's forecast that 2.6 million people could be unemployed by next year. Chancellor Rishi Sunak joins us now. Very good morning to you, Mr. Sunak. Thank you for your time this morning. I want to start, if we may, with the freeze on public sector pay. And I'm going to hand, in a way, this question over to one or two people who've been in touch with us this morning. So Duncan has sent us a message, knowing we were going to speak to you. And he said, my question is, why only NHS workers, the only essential workers that deserve a pay rise? Why not teachers, bus drivers or local council workers? How would you explain to a bus driver, you have to cast our minds back a little bit to the risks they took early on and the lives that were lost, and explain to someone who does that job why they don't deserve a pay rise?
Well, thank you, Charlie. I think if you take a step back and you talked about the economic emergency, that's the context which we're dealing with. So we've got record levels of borrowing and debt, an economy that's suffering enormous stress. And I wanted to get on, as you thankfully acknowledged, in investing in the things that people really care about. So new hospitals, better schools, safer streets, and the infrastructure that can transform our country. In order to do that, I've had to make some tough choices. And what I couldn't do is justify an across-the-board rise in public sector pay. When we came into this crisis, there was already a disparity between public and private sector pay, with a premium in the public sector. That disparity has widened during this crisis. What we've seen in the private sector is that wages have fallen over the last 6 months by about 1%. In the public sector, wages have gone up by 4%. And people in the private sector are losing their jobs, their hours being cut, they're being furloughed. That hasn't happened in the public sector. So given that, I think we need to take a more targeted approach to what we do. So what we've done is say that those working in the NHS, because we're in the midst of a health crisis and they're on the front line of dealing with that they will be given a pay rise next year, subject to the recommendations of the pay review body. For everyone else, pay rises will be paused. But we do want to make sure that we try and help those on lower incomes. So if you're in the public sector and you earn less than £24,000, which is the UK median basic salary, then you will get a £250 at least pay increase next year. If you take all of that together, that means that a majority of people working in the public sector will see their pay increase next year. I'm determined to try and protect jobs, and this will help me protect jobs in the public sector, and I think it's a reasonable and proportionate approach given the context.
1.3 million people, we understand, will be directly affected by the pay freeze in the public sector: firefighters, teachers, prison officers. You've done the maths. How much would it have cost to have included them?
Well, I mean, the numbers will be published by the Office for Budget Responsibility. They'll be obviously in the billions of pounds.
So can you give us a number? You must know, because you must have calculated it.
Yeah, yes, I said it's in the billions of pounds. People will have slightly different ways of calculating it.
What's your way?
I think but the point is, a majority of people working in the public sector will see their pay increase next year as a result of these decisions, and it will help us crucially protect jobs. I think your programme mentioned already 750,000 people, almost all in the private sector, have already lost their jobs through this crisis. That's a tragedy. I want to try and protect jobs best I can, and taking this approach will mean that I can protect more jobs in the public sector. Obviously, if you've got a given budget, what you want to do is try and maximise employment within that, and this will help me do that whilst ensuring fairness across the board.
So people might look at your speech yesterday. I'll take one phrase. These are your own words from the speech you made yesterday. You talked about the government setting the direction in terms of the budgets, and then you went on to say the spending announced today is secondary to the courage, wisdom, kindness and creativity it unleashes. Now, I go back to my original question, which is, talk about courage, kindness, wisdom. You could say that. That's what teachers were doing. They were going back into the classrooms where they were teaching children who may well have COVID. And yet you say those words, but you don't reward them.
Well, this is about, I think you're trying to confuse two things. I mean, this is about protecting people's jobs. And what I want to do is protect as many teachers' jobs as I can and make sure that we can keep putting more teachers into classroom, which is exactly what we're doing, make progress towards our goal of the starting salary being £30,000, which is also what we're doing over time. And we're seeing that in record numbers of people applying to be teachers. The numbers significantly up now over last year, £2.2 billion more for schools, meaning every pupil in this country will see a 2% at a minimum rise in funding next year, as well as getting on with rebuilding and refurbishing 500 schools over the next decade with a long-term settlement of capital there. We're also investing in skills. So look, education is really important to me. I want to make sure we can make all of those investments and protect teachers' jobs. And taking this approach to pay, I think, is reasonable and proportionate given the circumstances.
So you're talking about employment there and unemployment. The Office for Budget Responsibility talking about a projection of 2.6 million unemployed next year. Do you accept that figure? Do you agree with that figure? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, we're living at a time of unprecedented economic uncertainty, and the Office for Budget Responsibility actually put 3 different scenarios out, which they rarely do, which gives you a sense of how volatile the environment is. But there are independent forecasters, and the government doesn't do its own forecast anymore, doesn't mark its own homework in that way, and that is a projection that they've put out. It's broadly in line with those from other people who do this as well, and it's obviously a tragedy, right? With 750,000 people have already lost their jobs, and this is my single biggest priority, is to try and protect as many people's jobs as possible. That's why in the summer, back in July, we outlined our plan for jobs with initiatives like the Kickstart scheme to help create jobs for young people, incentives for companies to take on apprenticeships. We've obviously had the furlough scheme, which has protected 9 million jobs, and I'm glad that the Office for Budget Responsibility acknowledged in their report, joining the IMF and the Bank of England, that our economic interventions had indeed saved jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and reduced the amount of unemployment that we're going to see.
So cast forward, if you would, Mr. Sunak. So this figure, the 2.6, and I appreciate it's not your figure, but is it your belief, not a hope, is it your belief that the steps you're taking now will mean that 2.6 figure is lower in the middle of next year? Is that your belief?
So actually, rather than my belief, it's a statement from the Office for Budget Responsibility that figure would have been higher had we not taken the steps that we have. And in saying that, they've joined the Bank of England and the IMF, who recently were here looking at everything that we've done in the UK, who said the same. They said the actions that the government has taken have helped mitigate some of the damage, reduced the level of unemployment, the level of business failures. So I am confident that the measures we've taken throughout this crisis have helped keep that number lower than it otherwise might have been. But people should know that we're not done. Jobs remain my number one priority. We started our plan for jobs in July. We will keep coming at it. Yesterday, I announced £3 billion for a new programme called Restart to help those who have been out of work for over a year find new work, and that's something that we think can make an enormous difference, and hopefully we can bring all these numbers down. But we will keep at this. This is my number one priority. Work is so important for the security, purpose and fulfillment that it brings an individual and their family, which is why it remains something that I will relentlessly focus on.
Chancellor, why don't you treat people with a bit more respect and level with them about the long-term tax implications of all your spending? You made no mention of it yesterday. Why don't you just tell people taxes will go up?
Well, because it was a spending review yesterday, not a budget.
I'm asking you that question now.
Well, and I'll give you the same answer. It wouldn't be appropriate for chancellors, any chancellor, to speculate about future tax policy, because that has real-world implications. And as you would find from any chancellor, they would talk about fiscal policy at a budget. And obviously, we have budgets. We'll have one in the spring. We normally have them in the autumn. But what I did say very clearly yesterday, and have said consistently throughout this, is the scale of the borrowing that we're undertaking this year is obviously not sustainable. Record peacetime highs in borrowing and debt. The forecasts that were set out yesterday show us on a path where that continues to be at very elevated levels. Now that's not a sustainable position. I've been very clear about that. But I think I'm supported by most economic commentators who would say, look, now is not the time to address that because we're in the midst of a crisis. So right now we want to focus on protecting jobs, as we've just spoken about. But once we get through this and we have more certainty about the economic outlook, we will need to look at how we can make sure we have a strong set of public finances. Not least because part of the reason I've been able to react comprehensively and generously in trying to support people during this crisis is because I inherited a strong economy, a strong set of public finances, thanks to decisions made by my
predecessors. Okay, let's not go backwards. I would really want to move forward.
That's something that we want to return to.
The question was a straightforward one in a way. I don't understand why it's so hard for you to say to people that in future taxes will have to go up to pay for what I'm doing now. Why is that so difficult?
Because it wouldn't be appropriate for a chancellor to comment on future fiscal policy because it has a real-world impact. What people need to know is that what our primary focus is right now is helping people to get through this crisis, protecting both their health and their jobs. And when we have more clarity once we're through this about the outlook, we'll have a new set of forecasts and numbers which will show exactly what the situation is, and the difference between the various OBR scenarios that they published yesterday is quite significant. So we don't quite know exactly what the scale of the issue is, but people can see yesterday that we had to start making some tough choices to enable us to deliver the things that we want and people's priorities, whilst making sure that we have public finances that can be on a path to being more sustainable, and that's a sense of where we're heading.
OK, let's rattle through a couple more issues. Universal credit wasn't included in the spending review yesterday. The decision on that £20 extra universal credit is currently in place until next April. Why don't you clarify what the situation will be for people then, and tell us whether it will be extended so that people, you were talking about planning, so that people can know in advance?
Well, we put at the beginning of this crisis lots of different measures in to help people. One of those was a temporary one-year uplift in universal credit, given that we were dealing with many months of a national lockdown, very severe set of restrictions that was, and the period of acute panic. That was a temporary increase. It runs all the way through to next spring, as you said, and it wouldn't be right to make a permanent decision about that now when the economic outlook is so uncertain. So, as I said, it provides security to people through to next spring. As we've done throughout this crisis, we've made sure we look after those who are the most vulnerable. But let's get to that point. Let's see where we are with the economy, the health restrictions, and then decide what the best way to support people who need our help is. And we can make a clearer decision about that next year.
And if I may, one last question. Obviously, it's our lead story this morning. A lot of people will be paying close attention. 11:30 this morning, they will find out where in England, which tier you are in. These are crucial decisions for health reasons, also in terms of businesses that can or cannot open. There is a lot riding for these individual communities on today's announcements.
No, that's absolutely right. And I know people, are frustrated. Of course, it's frustrating living under restrictions, especially the last month has been difficult for everybody. The Prime Minister will be making a press conference. We're doing a press conference later. The Health Secretary will be making a statement in Parliament later as well. We have a cabinet meeting later this morning to go over these things and finalise them. But people will see, what I can say is people will see a tangible change wherever they are compared to the last 4 weeks where we've been living with these difficult restrictions. As you saw on Monday in the statement the Prime Minister set out, there are significant differences to that, regardless of the tier. So more of our life can resume, more of our economic activity can resume. I know obviously how difficult this is, not just for families but for businesses. We've put a lot of support in to help businesses and to help local councils get through this. I'm confident that the last 4 weeks has made a difference. The numbers are all heading in the right direction, and of course, although Christmas is not going to be normal, hopefully after the last 4 weeks we can move to a better place and more testing. There's some light at the end of the tunnel.
Chancellor Rishi Sunak, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.